You mentioned there a bit about the Treaty on the Prohibition for Nuclear Weapons. I was wondering if you could just explain a bit more about it and also what that means. It's an incredible achievement, so what it means for human rights and women in the UK and the UK's women's sector.
Okay, I'll try. So the treaty, it's a prohibition treaty, which is absolute. And until we got this treaty, weapons of mass destruction had been prohibited because of their humanitarian impact, and a certain class of weapons, even to people that think that the use of force is okay and that wars are in some way justified, there are still, even for those people, there are certain weapons that go beyond the beyond. And the first one to be outlawed in that kind of way were dum-dum bullets, because they were deliberately created to cause the maximum suffering and damage that it was possible to create, and to leave people with incurable and untreatable injuries. So the world at large said, no, that is really going too far. We're not going to do that. You know, it's not justified. And so they were prohibited. In that happened in 1890 something. So, you know, it's part of what has led to a body of shared understanding of what's acceptable, that is then becomes, by virtue of the fact that it is shared by the world and becomes a world view, it becomes part of international humanitarian law. And if a country breaks that, then they earn the disapproval of all the other countries. It's not like the kind of law you have in a domestic situation where there's some senior person that says, that's against the law, I can punish you and put you in jail for doing it. It works because it's going against the accepted norm. But to achieve that, you need to get a bunch of countries to agree to something and to accept that something is outside of the norm in the first place. So that's been done with with all of the other weapons of mass destruction. There is a convention on chemical weapons. Landmines are banned. Mustard gas and biological weapons, all of these are subject to a prohibition. And so it was decided that the way to try and, rather than try and limit or control the use of nuclear weapons, the thing to do was to get a prohibition treaty going that would say nowhere, no time, never, unacceptable, not to be used. And to try and build consensus around that by having the majority of the world's countries who are starting with a small number of people who agreed that and building on that. So that's what this treaty does. And to reach that point, the first thing that happened were 3 international conferences, which were not held under the auspices of United Nations, but there was a core group of 4 or 5 countries that accepted ICAN's, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, accepted their view that these weapons should be subject to a prohibition treaty. And the humanitarian aspect was supplemented by the fact that every other treaty that there is on nuclear weapons doesn't prohibit them absolutely. And that although countries have been asked to reduce the numbers, and although United Nations made a resolution, the very first resolution they ever made was to get rid of nuclear weapons. But these other treaties haven't achieved that. So the failure of other treaties was one factor. The humanitarian aspect, and the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent coming out with a statement that in the event of an exchange, a small, if you like, war involving nuclear weapons, the impact on the world would be so great that they would be unable to make any meaningful response. They wouldn't be able to come in and rescue people. So that was a huge trigger in negotiating the treaty. All the work that I've already spoken about that was done by Reaching Critical Will in bringing on board the perspective on women and the experience of women has meant that when these 3 humanitarian conferences were done and United Nations agreed to start negotiations for a treaty, then it was a very important part of it that it included reference to the disproportionate impact on women and girls. And it's the first treaty on nuclear weapons that does that. So it's very, very important for us. And it's very important for women that are engaged in a feminist understanding of what foreign policy should look like, that they should reference this treaty and highlight what it's saying, because it's an extremely important and significant development. So so that was really what brought that to the fore. And what the treaty says is that all nuclear weapons are prohibited, transporting nuclear weapons is prohibited, storing nuclear weapons is prohibited, sharing nuclear weapons with another state is prohibited. Needless to say, the tiny number of nuclear armed states, 9 countries out of 193, are totally opposed to the treaty, and that includes the UK government. And it also includes the governments that are complicit or overly reliant on the nuclear armed states. So, but again, it's still a very small number of the world's countries that don't support this treaty. There was a vote taken at United Nations in December last year, where 130 out of the 193 supported the treaty and said it should enter into force. There have been polls done in countries that have nuclear weapons, and their civil society longs for their governments to sign the treaty and to prohibit nuclear weapons. They are the most undemocratic things imaginable, as well as being inhumane and dangerous. So, but the other work that was done in building for the treaty that is of great significance across the board for women is the amount of information that came out about the relationship between the use of nuclear weapons, the practice of holding nuclear weapons, the testing of nuclear weapons, and the prevailing political circumstances that are required in order to have nuclear weapons, are all things that are exactly the same things that make the acceleration of climate change such a reality as it presently is. And if you can imagine what the impact on accelerating climate change would be of a nuclear exchange, and how irreversibly it would set back any good measures that could be taken to combat climate change, you're beginning to get an idea. But the other thing is, of course, that they're inextricably linked, because the impact of climate change and reduced water resources, creating conflict across all sorts of countries, that is all increasing the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons. So that's the other reason why there's so, you know, our work in WILPF on disarmament and human rights, I've always seen these things as being interlinked, and nowhere is it more clearly seen than around the nexus of climate change, nuclear weapons, and self-determination for women. Our job is to try and, if you like, enlarge the perspective on nuclear weapons, the straight-up nuclear disarmament movement. I mean, CND does a terrific job, and it's concerned with the UK's nuclear weapons, and rightly so. But the particular emphasis that we bring to it is seeing nuclear weapons as part of an overall human rights issue, of seeing nuclear weapons as a hugely important and significant factor in our work in welcoming immigrants and asylum seekers from other places on the planet to this country, we see nuclear weapons as an integral part of the way in which we're mismanaging the environment. And these are the feminist arguments that have to be added to, and the internationalist perspective that have to be added to the straight up, let's get rid of nuclear weapons CND message. So that's our unique selling point on it.
You did briefly again touch on it when you were talking about your work in the UK at the moment, but I was just wondering if you could finish by talking a bit about what you would ideally like to see happen now, and what more can be done to make future progress on this issue in the UK and around the world.
Well, I mean, obviously, from what I've already said, you'll gather that I see, although I'm Scottish through and through, but I'm an internationalist, and I see this as an international issue. The UK's nuclear weapons are all in Scotland, my country, so that's a big and important part of what's happening. I would like to see Scotland becoming an independent country and being able to redesign its own future, which would not include nuclear weapons, and accede to the treaty, because the UK doesn't have anywhere else to put them. So that would be an end to the UK, and it would be the beginning of the fall of a pile of dominoes immediately. But more than that, I would like to see us moving towards a real understanding of the extreme racist nature of these things. The inherent racism is part of the oppressive nature of the patriarchal system that allows for such things to exist. I would like to see a lot more people of colour engaged with the nuclear weapons and climate change campaigning, and for us to be together in that. It's a global view that we're seeking of a different and better and more welcoming world. So far more integrated campaigning, far more careful listening to each other. One of the things I love about WILPF is the Voices of African Women project, which means that diaspora women from African countries in the UK are in a position to speak to us about their lived experience, and that's of huge value in what I see as my intervention in this struggle, which happens to be about Scotland and nuclear weapons, but that's just because of where I am, and but I think that WILPF has a huge part to play in making the struggle more integrated, more broadly based, and at the same time also more evidence-based, and I think we have the capacity to keep the arguments on our own terms on the things that trouble us, and not buy into answering ridiculous questions about some kind of political scenario that we don't support in the first place. So that's what I hope we can do.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing all your knowledge and experience. And
well, thank you for hosting me, Laura. It's been really nice talking to you.